What's happening, fishing friends? Welcome to another episode. Today we're talking about fishing lines. Specifically, should you be using braided fishing line or not? This is a question that I get multiple times a week. You know, some people I hear say, why are you using braid? It's junk. Or some people say, I've heard my buddy says I should use braid. It's the best line out there. There's tons of stuff out there. What do you do? Well, I'm here to try and help you out. I'm going to tell you what braided fishing line actually is, the advantages and disadvantages of braided line, and where I use it, when, where, how I use braided fishing line in my everyday fishing. Okay, so what is braided fishing line really? Well, unlike your normal monofilament or fluorocarbon fishing lines, these are nylon lines. Braid is not that. It depends on the braid you get. Some are like a high molecular polyethylene, they'll call on it. Some, like the P-line, they'll say it's like a Teflon base. Some use a Gore-Tex. There's all kinds of stuff out. So braided line is really made up of a bunch of little small fibers. They take all those fibers and put them in the strands. And then they take those strands and weave them together or braid them together to make a braided fishing line. That's really what braided line is. It's like a really small, tiny rope, you can think of it. So when you go to pick out a braid, there's a bunch of them out there on the market. Like I said, they're going to define what type of braid it is by the strand count. So like you can see this Daiwa J braid, 4-strand, some Suffix 832 and 8-strand. Same thing for this, like a Finesse, this P-line TCB braid, an 8-strand. So generally speaking, the lower strand count it has, when you actually feel the line, it's going to feel a little bit rougher. You're going to be able to feel those little woven strands together. It's going to feel rough, and that's usually going to make it a little bit stronger because each one of those strands that they're braiding together is bigger in diameter, as opposed to if you go to like an 8 or 9 strand, it's going to feel softer, smoother. It's going to feel more like an actual fishing line. You're not going to feel that roughness. Keep that in mind, and that's not the way with every line out there. There's always exceptions, but that's kind of the way I look at it. You know, people say the lower the strand count, it's going to feel rougher, you know, like a saw. They use it in heavier vegetation. With the lower strand count, it's going to be a lot softer, easier to cast. They're going to use it for finesse stuff. Again, people do it different ways. I'm just giving you the general basics. So let's get to the advantages and disadvantages. First off, let's start with the good stuff. The advantage of using a braid. Why would you want to put this on? Well, number one, braid doesn't stretch. So unlike your monofilament, which is pretty stretchy, fluorocarbon does stretch. It just takes more power to stretch the mono, but braid doesn't stretch. Now that is an advantage and a disadvantage, but we're going to talk about the good part of it. Braid not stretching is great because when you make a long cast, so for example, this was my old frog rod, you make a real long cast with the frog and you have a fish take that under, you don't have any slack to take up. You don't have to you know, compensate for the stretch in that line. It's a direct connection to your lure, so you can set that hook. It's going to give you better hook penetration on those nice long casts with that lack of stretch. Like I said, for me, I use it for frog fishing. I've even heard of guys using it for like long distance cranking because of that lack of stretch. You know, if you make a super long cast on topwater or, you know, with a deep crankbait and you get a bite, you've got to really set that hook and pull into them because you have to account for that stretch. Now, of course, you have to take into consideration, you know, what type of rod, how soft your rod is, all that. But just generally speaking, braid has no stretch, so keep that in mind. Next is the sensitivity. You can't deny that braid is the most sensitive fishing line out there. Again, there's no stretch, so it's not like monofilament. You get a bite and some of that line kind of absorbs that because it has that stretch. Braid is like a direct connect. If you've never used braid, I remember the very first time I used braid a long time ago, I was like, oh, this feels so weird. Like when you're dragging it over stuff, you know, if you have mono, it kind of feels spongy and you have to almost like pop it over it. With braid, you can feel it right away, like what's down there. A lot more sensitive, so, you know, the way I think of it is finesse bites, things where the bite is really tough. The sensitivity of braid is unmatched. It's definitely the most sensitive. You can take a cheap rod and put mono on it and it feels eh. You put braid on it and you can bump that sensitivity way up. So again, keep that in mind in your combo, your arsenal. If you've got, you know, you can only afford one rod and it's, you know, an $80 rod and you're like, oh, this isn't that sensitive. If you've never used braid, try it and you'll be surprised how many more bites and how much you can feel of that bottom contact and such. Okay, the next thing about braid is the diameter. The diameter of braid is a lot smaller than the equal monofilament. So for example, like this is a 10-pound braid. Can you see on there what that says? What the monofilament equal is? 2-pound mono. So the diameter of this braid is like using a 2-pound monofilament. So it's the exact same diameter. They're the same width. If you look at them side to side, they would be the exact same width. However, this has a 10-pound breaking point as opposed to mono that would have a 2-pound breaking point. It's crazy. So like if you use a 65-pound braid, that may only be like I don't know, 12 or 15 pound fluorocarbon or mono. I don't know what the exact difference is, but it's a lot smaller diameter. So you'll notice when you put it on your reel, you can fit a lot more braid because of that smaller diameter on your reel. So that's something to keep in mind, especially if you're making long casts on stuff. You know, if you're really trying to cover water, braid is a great way to go because you can put more on your reel. Also, braid doesn't get old. With your nylon lines, mono and fluoro, when those sit in the sun and they're exposed to UV light, they get weak. Braid doesn't have that issue. So you can have braid on a reel for a long time. Now, of course, it will start to lose its color, you know, as it starts to get worn out, but it doesn't get old. It's not like you're going to leave it in the sun. Oh, now it's going to just be breaking and weak. No, you can keep it on there. It makes it great for a backing on your reels. You don't have to worry about it getting brittle or anything. And you can just use it season after season if you're not breaking off a ton. Works great. All right, the next big benefit of braid is it doesn't have any memory. And if you don't know what memory is, if I take this reel that has some old monofilament on it, this was just some cheap stuff I was using for a casting test. Look at, you see that? How that springs and it forms those little circles. Looks like a slinky, right? It's all curled up, it's in circles. If you've ever had that, it can be a huge pain in the neck to deal with. Braid, don't have to worry about that. Let me show you. Take, for example, this old frog reel that I haven't used for, well, it's been since a year ago. Look at that. That's old braid. And you see how straight that is on there as it goes down my arm like that? Hopefully you can see that there. No memory in it at all. It's not going to coil up. It doesn't form. Memory means it doesn't form to the size of that spool or to the shape of that spool, right? It's still just, you know, a limp. Like I said, it almost feels like a rope on that reel. So that's a huge benefit, you know, when you're casting. You don't have to mess with the coils, or if you're, you know, like flipping out a jig or a Texas rig. You flip that on a braid, it's going to be straight, hanging, you know, nice and perfect. Whereas if you've got a bunch of memory in your reel, old fluorocarbon, you flip it out there and it's got all those springy circles, it's hard to feel stuff with all that in there. So you've got to change. Line more often on fluorocarbon and mono. Don't have to change it, like I said, on braid. It doesn't get old and it doesn't get that memory. Okay, now the final benefit of braid is you can see it. So braid comes in bright colors and you're thinking, well, I've heard the old, you know, deal that fish can see color, right? Or they can see line. I do believe that, and we're going to get into that more and kind of explain this reasoning, but on applications where you need to see if your line's moving, where there's a real finesse bite, line watching is something that newer folks don't do enough. You know, they're throwing it out there and they're waiting to feel the bite. But I can't tell you how many times a lure's, you know, just fluttering down and that fish grabs it. You can't even feel it, but you can see your line move, and that's a lot easier to do with the braid as opposed to a mono or a fluorocarbon that is really hard to see, especially if you've got dirty water. And that happens to be a perfect segue into the disadvantages. Visibility. You can see braid, right? If you're in a spot where fish are really finicky, if they get a lot of pressure, if you're using like a big 65-pound braid and you're trying to like drag a Texas rig or something, it's open, clear, the fish get a good look at that. I personally think that makes a difference. You're not going to get as many bites as if you were using a, you know, like a 10-pound fluorocarbon, 12-pound fluorocarbon, mono, whatever. Fish can't see that as well, especially fluorocarbon. It really blends in with the water. With that braid, if you're dragging a lure, the fish is going to be able to see that directly to it. So when it's a tough bite and finesse stuff, I usually go to something else. Now, I still use braid on my finesse, but I use a leader. And again, we're going to talk about that soon, but visibility can be a disadvantage. All right, the next disadvantage, it's going to feel like a broken record, is the lack of stretch. Debo, you just said that was an advantage, right? Well, it can be a disadvantage. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to and said, Debo, I was casting, I had a little bit of a backlash and my lure broke and went sailing. So we're using like 20, 30-pound braid. They're like, yeah, I put 20-pound braid on. Okay, that's the issue. A smaller diameter, smaller braid doesn't have any give. So when you cast a lure out and you backlash with mono or fluoro, there's a little bit of stretch in it. You usually don't break off. Especially if you go with a small, lighter diameter braid, when you backlash and that lure gets to the end of that line, snap. There's no give, there's no shock absorption in that braid. And that's usually when you're going to break a lure off and you watch it sail off into the sunset and you're like, oh, that was a $20 lure and now it's gone in 2 casts. Another big thing is playing fish. So if you have braid on a rod that doesn't have very much give to it, like an extra fast rod, if you're trying to play a fish with no stretch in the braid and no bend in the rod, it can be a bad deal. So usually you want some sort of give in your, your system if you're going to play a fish, meaning let him take the drag and such. Usually like, we'll say a spinning rod has more of a parabolic, a bendy action. You can use that absorption in the rod to play the fish. Or, with like a mono, it's real stretchy, so you've got a little bit of give so that fish can't get slack and toss that hook. You got to remember, braid doesn't have that slack that gives. So you've got to either use a softer rod, you've got to use a leader, different things to think about. But just remember, braid does not have any stretch, so it can be your friend or a foe. The next disadvantage of braid is the durability. Now, braid is awesome around grass, open water and stuff where you're not gonna get this, actually rubbing against stuff. Again, that braid is made up of all kinds of little fibers woven together. But if you get this around rocks, rubbing against rocks, rough dock pilings, even some rough wood, you can snap braid super easy. So, if I'm around wood and stuff, I usually go to fluorocarbon. Braid does awesome around grass. People say that this kind of helps saw through the vegetation. And if you could feel this, listen. Hear that sound? That's how rough this is. It can kind of help saw through that vegetation. And again, if you get a fish stuck in there, you're just wanting to winch him out. If you get a fish stuck in some lily pads and stuff, you don't want a bunch of stretch and give of mono. You want to get a direct connect to them and winch them out as quick as you can. So again, that lack of stretch can be either your friend or foe. Same thing for the durability of braid. It can be your friend getting it out of vegetation, but if you get, you're throwing a jig on straight braid and you're in the rocks, man, and you can even see here kind of how it frays. That's what I'm talking about. It'll kind of break and fray all those little fibers apart and break your line. So keep that in mind. If I'm around a bunch of rough stuff, I'm usually going to like a fluorocarbon. You can even use a mono, but braid is usually not my deal when I'm around like rough dock stuff, rocks, that kind of thing. Okay, the last one is the ability to get these out. As a beginner, I usually recommend a soft monofilament, something like this Trilene XL in the red box. Super soft. I've used it for a long time. It casts well. Now the thing about braid is an advantage, and I didn't really touch on that, is it does cast really well. Because of that lack of memory, it casts well. It's not going to coil up. However, if you do get a backlash with braid and this all starts to knot up and it gets tied together, if you try to just pull that knot out, braid can sink down and dig right down into the middle where it makes it almost impossible to get out. It can knot up. You've got to be careful. So I personally think it's easier for a beginner to pick out a backlash with like a monofilament, a soft mono, as opposed to braid. You're going to get different answers. Some people say if you're a beginner starting out, use braid. However, another big disadvantage of braid is most of them are a little bit more expensive. So, with the Trilene, $5-6 around here, you can get this. A lot of braids, you're going to be paying over $10 to spool a reel at least. So keep that in mind. It's my personal belief that it's easier to get those backlashes out with this compared to this. Okay, when and where do I use braid? How do I incorporate braid into my arsenal? I've got a few different rods and reels. Where have I found braid fits me best? Well, this is actually something that Tackle Junkie told me to pick up. I still haven't used this yet, but frogging and flipping, right? For me, the big thing is frogging. I use braid without a doubt for frog fishing. I mean, you can see on my old Tatula, you see this in a couple videos recently, the old LFS, both of these different braids, but braids that I have used to catch frog fish. The reason for that is, I kind of touched on it earlier, when you're making a long cast with the frog and you have a fish come up in those pads or scum or any sort of vegetation and grab that lure, you don't want to have a bunch of stretch in there because I'm telling you, you get a little bit of slack, you give that fish a little bit of loose line in vegetation and such, that fish is gone. So when I'm frog fishing in thick stuff, or if you're pitching, flipping like a punch rig and mats, something like that, you want to have a direct connect to that fish and get that fish out of there as quick as you can. You don't want to play the fish like you would on lighter line, give it slack, let it, kind of do its thing. It's going to bury in there and make it almost impossible to get out, unless you have a boat and you can go over to it. But I want to hit that fish and I want to muscle him out of there as quick as I can, and there's no better way to do that than with braid. Again, on those long casts with the frog, I'm sure I got a frog around here. This is actually one you're going to see in an unboxing soon, but you look at those frog hooks, you're trying to drive 2 large frog hooks into the roof of that fish's mouth, on a long cast through vegetation. You want to have that direct connect with braid. You want to be able to set that as far as you're moving your rod, that's how much line you're moving. Whereas with mono, you might move your rod this far, but with the stretch, you might have only moved that lure, just a tiny amount because it's way out there. That line is stretchy and has give. So without a doubt, you've seen it on my channel a ton. I frog fish a lot. I'm a huge proponent of frog fishing with braid. Other channels will tell you, you can do this, you can do that. That's fine. This is just my opinion, but I'll stand on that hill and make arguments for it. frog fishing, you use braid, you'll be happy you did. What size? Now for me, it's usually gonna be 50 or 65 pound braid. I tried a few this year that I was not happy with. You know that if you watch my recent videos, but I finally switched to some 65 pound P-line, the TCB braid. And this is a braid that's an 8 strand, so it's smoother. Usually I didn't use this stuff. So far, this has been actually working really well. The best budget braid that I've used a ton, and I have had no issues with this, is the Daiwa J braid. Of course, like Randall, he loves the like the regular Power Pro. Suffix 832 is a really good braid, but you're going to be going up in price. Again, for me, I've been using the TCB stuff for frog and haven't had an issue, and it's what I use in my finesse stuff. You're going to see that here in a second. Finesse. This is the number 2 thing, or the second most important time I think of braid in my arsenal. Hands down, all of my spinning rods have braid on them. Now, that you're going to watch different videos out there, and some people will tell you, you know, spool up straight mono, spool up straight fluorocarbon. But for me, the way I fish around here, I have not had an issue going straight braid and then going to a leader. So I don't actually fish. Remember how we were talking about that braid is very bright. That's like a neon yellow, that TCB braid. Very bright, and I believe fish can see that. So I personally don't fish straight braid. And there's been times that Rand Dizzle and I have fished next to each other. He was using a straight blue braid, and I was using like this neon yellow with a fluorocarbon leader, and I outfished him a bunch. Now, I'm not saying that's because of you know, the braid. In that certain instance, it worked. 100 variables, that's what makes fishing so hard, but I'm a huge believer in fish can see line, they can be line shy, so going braid to a leader. And that just means taking your braided line and tying on like a fluorocarbon or a mono leader. When I tie that knot on, it doesn't go down into my reel. You don't want to do that because that connection knot can get caught in this braid. Remember, this is an extremely small diameter, so I always make sure my connection knot is in front of the reel, but behind the first guide on my spinning rod. So I've got probably I don't know, 7-8 feet of a fluorocarbon leader that those fish, you know, that I've got direct connect to my lure, that those fish can't see this line. You know, it's 7-8 feet back. They're not directly thinking, oh, there's braid over there. I wonder if that guy's got a leader tied on with an Alberto knot. No, I'm not eating that, shaky head. The other thing that's awesome about putting braid, this, you know, small diameter braid, usually 10 or 15 pound is what I go to on my spinning rigs, is, again, it doesn't have that memory. You can see how straight that line is. Doesn't have that memory, and it just casts so well. On a spinning rod, small diameter, no memory, you can zing stuff out there and then just have your, you know, your leader on there to get the benefit of both worlds. Overall, spinning rods are going to be a little bit softer and more spongy than a casting rod. So I'm usually using fluorocarbon, but if you need something to float, you know, if you're walking like a little finesse topwater walking bait, you might want to go to braid to a little, like for example, a 10-pound mono leader. And the mono leader on braid will help not get that braid caught up in the topwater lure hooks. Because if you're walking a lure, it's going back and forth. That braid is really limp. You can kind of get the braid stuck in the hooks. But with the mono leader on there, the mono's a little bit stiffer and it kind of sticks out in front of the bait. You don't get it tangled up as much. I feel like I've gone on a few different tangents. Anyway, spinning rods for me, I always use 10 or 15 pound braid. Love it for finesse spinning rod applications. All right, fishing friends, I need you to do me a huge favor and comment below. Let me know if this type of video helps you out, if it's helpful for you new anglers out there, or even folks who have fished a while, just to kind of give you my viewpoint. This is something I used to do, 3 years ago. It was called Fish Food for Thought, and I was just taking random subjects and giving you my thoughts on them, how I do it. Things to help other anglers out there, because I feel like, and I have so many people reach out to me about, you know, they're just starting bass fishing. I think there's a big need to get into that and help all the new people that, you know, that got into fishing last year and this year. So do me a huge favor and comment below. Let me know if this helps, and let me know when you, if you've ever used braid or when you use braid in your arsenal. It will be awesome to go through the comments, have other people read, and just kind of see how other folks do it, because I'm not here to tell you what's 100% right or wrong. I'm just telling you how I do it. I'm going to give you some facts, what I think are the advantages, the disadvantages, and it's up to you to make that decision. You know, not a right and wrong way. Go out and watch other videos on it, but hopefully this helps answer your question. Should you use braid or not? All right, tonight's subscribed fishing friend is my guy, AJ Lance. AJ reached out to me. We were talking back and forth. We both have our our furry friends. Mr. Stubbs is actually upstairs. He was just laying here by me, then he heard something. He got nosy. But talking about our dogs, how much we love our dogs and such. And they really are, they're a part of the family. So AJ, hope you're doing well, man. And hope everybody else out there is doing well. I thank you all so much for watching my channel. It means a bunch to me. Again, I've said it a million times, but I would not be here if it wasn't for all of you. So thank you so much for watching. It's time for me to edit and get this out for tomorrow. So until next time.